Welcome to the program. My guest is Shaun Kenney. Shaun is the former executive director of the Republican Party of Virginia and a contributing editor at Bearing Drift. It's bearingdrift.com. That's Virginia's conservative voice. Shaun, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me. It's great.
Very glad to see you again. I want to talk about what happened in a public park in Charlottesville, Virginia, not too long ago, when we saw 150, mostly, nearly all, white guys with Centronella torches,
right,
chanting, "The Russians are our friend," chanting Nazi slogans from Hitler's Third Reich. And they're part of the alt-right movement in America, led by Richard Spencer. What the hell happened? What was that all about?
So I mean, welcome to the identitarian right. So these are the nationalists. These are the ones that really do believe in identity politics just for white people. And it's interesting because a lot of the criticism afterwards was that these guys are Nazis, or these guys were the Klan, or they were fascists. And they really weren't quite that. This is a really sort of a new evil that can stand on its own two legs.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. And you're the best person to explain this because I've read your work on this, and you really explain this better than anybody else. And it's such an important point. This isn't the 21st century version of Nazis or of the Klan, which everybody's sort of dismissing it as that. This is something new and even scarier.
Yeah. So effectively what you have, and this is where the whole like Russia is our friend line comes in, right? That seems weird. Why do a bunch of white supremacists cheer Slavs in Russia? That just doesn't add up. So what you have here is if you rewind the tape all the way back, Richard Spencer's wife is the primary English translator for the works of a gentleman by the name of Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin is a Russian philosopher, came out of the Soviet Union, studied under what's called the Nouvelle Droite, or the French New Right, which is where you get Marine Le Pen and the National Front. Came back in the 1990s, the early 1990s, and what you have in front of him, if you can picture yourself in Dugin's shoes, is that the socialism had failed, right? Fascism, they beat, so fascism has failed. And you can start going through the 1990s in Russia with Yeltsin and whatnot, and they say that liberalism has also failed. So if you can kind of picture in your mind almost a diamond, so to speak, and on your right you have fascism, on your left you have socialism, and at the bottom you have liberty. What he does is he asserts something very different that he calls traditionalism. And it's within that he pretty much says that he kind of harkens back to Russia's past. And if you really think about it, you go back to the 1917 revolution in Russia, you had two revolutions. You had a red revolution, which was the communists, and then you had a white revolution, which was the nationalists. And it's of that white Russian ethnicity, it's the white Russian revolution that Dugin sort of pulls from. It's orthodoxy, nationalism, autocracy, all within sort of a Russian ethnicity that views their sphere of influence, not just in Europe, but in Asia as well, as something uniquely Russian, as something almost Neo-Byzantine in scope, that really views America and American interests as invasive, as destructive, as too individualistic, and something that's to be opposed by a much more communitarian, ethnic-based sort of ideology.
And Putin's leadership and his style of leadership is inspired by Dugin's work, right?
That's correct. So how direct Putin's work is connected to Dugin and Putin together, that's somewhat questionable. However, the circle of Russian thinkers that Dugin surrounds himself with, namely Ivan Ilyin, Berdaev, Vladimir Solovyov, these are all people that sort of embrace the idea of what's called the Third Rome. And it goes back to a certain prophecy that was made by an Orthodox monk back in the 14th century.
God.
Yeah. It gets that deep, but it's very important to the Russians themselves, and it's very important to the Russian character. Is that two Romes have fallen, a fourth there shall not be, and that third Rome is Moscow. And so between a marriage of the state and orthodoxy, so literally a union of church and state, which is something completely antithetical to what we believe as Americans, that there's a sort of holiness to this idea of a third Rome, and that there's a devotion to this that sort of separates them, that gives them a head up above the rest of their peers, namely Germans, Poles,
Yeah.
Hungarians, French, Americans.
And so the guys who are in the park in Charlottesville with their torches, rallying around a statue of Robert E. Lee, chanting, "Russia is our friend," if I understand you right, the context for that in Charlottesville has everything to do with white nationalist identity politics in Russia? And in Europe?
Well, more Slavic identity in Russia. But it does sort of play out. So it's one thing to say, well, you just say, like, these guys are a bunch of racists. Well, not really. What they're really saying, and that's no way, I'm not trying to excuse them by any stretch, but what they're really trying to say is Russia for the Russians, and Poland for the Poles, and France for the French, and America for the
Descendants of white Europeans.
That works just the same. And for African Americans, they too should have their own ethno-national state. As a matter of fact, if you ask them point blank, if you had Richard Spencer here, and he said, what is your ideal ethno-national state? They'll tell you Israel. They'll tell you apartheid South Africa. Those are their ideal ethno-national states, and that's what they'll lay on the table and say, shouldn't white people have an Israel? I mean, that's just archaic. Nobody in the United States believes that sort of thing, but when you transpose it over to European politics, there really is that sentiment. Where you saw it with the National Front with Marine Le Pen.
Yeah, absolutely.
With, France for the French, right? And you saw it with UKIP and the British National Front.
It's a balkanization of the whole globe.
And
like,
that's
you people go live over there, and it's sort of like the old small Southern American town where you had to live on the whites lived on this side of the tracks, and African Americans, people of color, lived on that side of the tracks, and it's that writ large for the globe.
And anything that exactly, and anything like the European Union or NATO that sort of globalizes as opposed to a nationalist response,
they don't like it,
is evil. I mean, to them, because that's
and they don't like democracy either, right?
No. So the Russians have tried democracy, right? According to Dugin and other thinkers, and it failed them, right? I mean, they saw what democracy brought. It brought the oligarchs. It brought the mob. It just didn't work. It didn't
now running the government.
It didn't weld to the Russian character. And so what they do is, rather than what we believe is a rule of law in the United States, where we have a constitution, we have laws, our legislators craft those laws, we readily assent to them. They don't believe in that at all. They believe that there has to be an autocrat in charge of the entire apparatus to provide what Ilian calls a conscience of law, which means that if the laws don't exactly square up in a certain instance, then an autocrat can pretty reach all the way down and say, well, here's how we're going to make that better. It's completely arbitrary. It's sort of the veneer of law, but it's completely alien to what Americans and Europeans would
denies
accept.
the 18th century revolutions in America and France. It
That's
completely
precisely
denies them outright.
That's precisely it. That's precisely it. And so what it does, though, is it does kind of rely on this communitarian aspect. And Dugin himself and others that are of that same thread, such as Julius Evola, somebody who, Steve Bannon, who's currently ensconced in the White House, quotes quite frequently. You sort of look back at the fascist experiment, so to speak, and say, well, that didn't work. What are the good parts in fascism we can pull out? And so they pull out these ideas of the Volk. They pull out these ideas of community. They pull out these ideas of blood and soil, and they say, this is the law. This is what we want. They say that pretty much, and if you actually dive into Spencer's work a little bit more deeply, he's very deterministic in his approach. He pretty much says that you and I are hardwired as a certain ethnicity or in a certain tribe that just sort of gets it when it comes to what's right for us. And other people of a different ethnicity or a different cultural background, they might have their own rules and their own way of doing it, but for the West and for Europeans, we built Western civilization. It only makes sense to us, and nobody else can be a part of that.
It reminds me of Herbert Spencer in the 1870s. It's a 19th century anthropology that, because you look a certain way, we're going to make all these conclusions about how your brain works.
And if you really think about it in terms of Alexander Dugin, he, when he first got started in the 1990s, the early 1990s, he actually called his project National Bolshevism, which sounds a lot like National Socialism, but for a reason. It actually predates National Socialism because it's the way that Stalin aggregated power. So you have the nationalists and the Bolsheviks. They're going to war in the Russian Civil War. They're absolutely tearing Russia apart, and then all of a sudden the Poles invade. And they go, what do we do? Well, the nationalists pretty set everything down and said, well, we're not going to let the Poles conquer Russia. We have to work with the Bolsheviks. And so the nationalists pretty much went to Stalin, not to Trotsky, not to Lenin, and said, we want to work with you. And that's how Stalin's rise to power occurred in the Soviet Union, through this union
Yeah.
of nationalism and Bolshevism, which was named National Bolshevism, which is why the Nazis looked back at it and said, well, gee, that sounds like a good idea.
And that idea of pulling the good parts of fascism out of the mid-20th century into the 21st century, giving it a fresh new name, I mean, that's what Putin's all about. I mean, when Putin's leadership is all about authoritarianism, because he believes that that is the best style of government, and we currently have a president whom we've yet to mention. He absolutely buys into that as well. He does truly believe that democracy doesn't work, it's not a good thing, that authoritarianism of a the state leader,
Right.
that's who you should follow.
To give you some sort of indication as to how committed Putin is to this traditional project, Ivan Ilyin was actually put on what was called the philosopher's boat in the 1940s and 1950s, pretty much shipped off and exiled. He died in Geneva, Switzerland in the 50s. Vladimir Putin, of course, rises to power. He actually had Ilyin reinterred to a cemetery in Moscow.
Wow.
Yeah, to pay respects. He's actually assigned Ilyin's works to members of the United Russia Party and said, you must read these.
Yeah.
This is important. This is the direction I want Russia to go. I mean, that's his commitment to the traditionalist project. That's his commitment to the Eurasianist project, which is what they call it.
Right, right.
And their arch enemies in that are the Atlanticists. And by Atlanticist, he means the United States.
And
so,
those old, I say old, but the traditional alliances that we've seen, NATO, the friendship between America and Germany, America and Britain,
all
these
special
guys
relationships.
hate that stuff.
Yeah, all the special relationship with the United States and the United Kingdom, they're actually okay with that because it's Anglo-Saxon. That's fine. That's your sphere. But the relationship with France, with Germany, with the European Union, NATO, all of this is anathema to them. And as much as they can do to break up those sort of alliances, TPP and TPA, for instance,
right.
I mean, masterfully done, they will do this because anything that anchors the United States as the hub to a global wheel threatens their existence as a global power.
Because they want to be that hub. They want to be the new Rome.
Well, I mean, they want to be a hub, right? And so this
Okay.
is where it starts getting a little bit entwined. It's a little bit more entwined. Alexander Dugin is a committed enemy of the United States. He believes that we destroyed the Soviet Union, that Russia will rise again if they just follow certain principles, that they really can break up the European Union and pretty much exile America to a
Destroy
second-rate
NATO,
zone.
yeah, all that stuff.
Just take us back to a second-rate power and make Russia the first-rate power, and then we'll see how that works. There are others who really don't believe that, at least initially, this was Putin's intent. There's a school of thought that says that Putin really does not want to be at odds with the European Union or the United States. He merely wants to be treated as an equal in a sort of tripartite alliance of the West.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, what's happened is that over the course of time, whether it's the Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, whatever, is that we've had certain incursions where we've expanded NATO, something they really didn't oppose in 2010, but now all of a sudden they really do. We've seen the expansion of the European Union, something that also bothers them. We've seen 2008 in Georgia, where we made certain guarantees to the Georgian government, and the Russians pretty much went in and revoked those guarantees by force of arms.
Yeah.
We've seen this in Syria. We've seen this in the Ukraine. We've seen it with the Baltic states, who are practically on a war footing right now. Where they've pretty much said that, and what really kicked this off was the Euromaidan revolution in the Ukraine in late 2013, early 2014. Kiev is very precious to the Russian character. It's where Russia got started. To have Kiev in pro-Western hands is just anathema to the Russians. It'd be like saying that Boston had a revolution, seceded from the rest of the United States, and was a pro-Russian client state. It would be that traumatic to the Russian character to have that.
Putin's not going to stand for that, and the tanks are going to roll. Continue to roll.
And there are 800 tanks in the Donbass region right now that simply materialized from nowhere. Gee, I wonder who could have sent them.
We're talking with Shaun Kenney. Got to take a very quick break. Stay with me. There's more when we get back. come back. We're talking with Shaun Kenney, the former director of the Republican Party of Virginia. You can read his work online at Bearing Drift. It's bearingdrift.com. There's also another website we want to promote. The
Jeffersoniad as well.
Jeffersoniad. Is it jeffersoniad.com?
Yeah, exactly.
Jeffersoniad.com. Check that out too. And you can follow Shaun on Twitter at SVKenney. Let's connect the dots, all right? Putin, Erdogan in Turkey, Trump in America, Le Pen in France, the Brexit movement in England. I mean, you look at the map and it's like, holy cow. Trump traveling to Europe and standing there in Europe and saying Germany is bad. I mean, that's Putin's dream.
Yeah.
That's Dugin's dream. It's like we want to have an American president that will come to Europe and say Germany is bad.
Right, and quite frankly, that's actually true. I mean, Putin speaks fluent German. That's actually the desk that he worked when he was at the KGB. So, he really admires the German. It's the German Wissenschaft, which is the German economic miracle. So you had Germany at the end of 1945. It's completely wiped out, and in 10 years they go from wasteland to economic powerhouse. He would like to affect that in Russia. He just doesn't know where to start. Probably the St. Petersburg region. But if he can duplicate the German social market for Russia, that's what he ultimately wants to do.
He wants to have his own internal Marshall Plan.
Exactly.
That's going to...
Exactly,
Yeah.
and that's why he had, I mean, if you look at Russian reserves before the Crimean War, he had about $500 billion to pretty much affect his own Marshall Plan for St. Petersburg, for that region, and then use that as a model to sort of export it to other republics within the Russian Federation. He very nearly got to that point, and then, things went bad in the Ukraine. So, there's something to be said there in terms of, well, is there anything really wrong with the German social market in Russia? Hypothetically, no, unless, of course, you're looking at it from a geopolitical perspective, and you don't want Russia to be a co-equal partner to the European Union. That's something where you could kind of get into the weeds and debate that.
Yeah.
But from the Russian perspective, the very moment that the Euromaidan coup occurred, or a revolution in our terms, at that rate, that's where the wheels came off. That's where they said, that's it. The West is out to destroy us. They want us to become a second-rate power. There's no way that we can work or reason with these people. Send in the little green men.
Yeah.
And that's effectively what happened.
So what's the threat? Somebody watching now who's thinking, we've been fighting with Russia too long. Why can't they be our friends? What's the real threat here? Why is it so wrong that Trump goes to Europe and says Germany is bad? What's wrong with that?
So here's the threat here, and this is where it gets somewhat interesting. So you've got a Russian version of traditionalism and Eurasianism that works over there. And in Europe, you see how it balkanizes. Poland for the Poles, Germany for the Germans, French for the French, Britain for the Britons, all this
Everybody
fun
throw
stuff.
up walls, keep out the immigrants.
Yep, destroy the EU. Well, that feeds into the Russian narrative, at least in terms of their geopolitical strategy. It's what they want. If they can balkanize Europe and set them apart, that means they're spending more on defense. It means they're spending more of their GDP into a deep, dark hole. And they're not spending on growing their economy, which only benefits, in their mind, the United States. And quite frankly, the United States benefits from EU partnership as well. But the problem is that there's really not a tradition of traditionalism in America the same way that there is in Europe. In Europe, you can kind of look back to this age of nobility. You can look at this age of an upper class that, in Jefferson's terms, was booted and spurred to ride the rest of humanity.
Yeah.
And if you really listen to what Spencer and the Citronella Nazis actually preach down in front of Lee Park, they actually believe that they are booted and spurred to ride the rest of us. That they are somehow this sort of Gnostic quality where they get it and the rest of us don't.
Yeah.
And they're gonna rule over us. But you have this tradition in Europe where you don't have it in the United States. So how do you make that work in the U.S.? Well, you do it through populism. You do it through something that says, well, the elites in Washington don't care about you. The bankers don't care about you. Everybody doesn't care about you. But an ideologue does. And it's the same way every ideologue in the world ever rises to power.
Right.
And they come back and they say these institutions are failing. The media can't be trusted. Trust no one. But
I am your voice.
But trust this
Quote
voice.
unquote Donald Trump.
That's I am your voice. That's exactly how it works. And so what happens is that rather than tapping into latent traditionalism in Europe, they tap into a latent strain of populism, which every 20 years America seems to go through this fever. And it worked. I mean, it was the dog that caught the car in 2016. Did the Russians, hijack the election? I don't buy that. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Did they play a role in the election in terms of social media and news outlets like Russia Today? Absolutely, they did.
Yeah.
And it's the same way that the Brits have BBC. France 24. They have Deutsche Welle over in Germany. They all report on the news. Xinhua for China. They all report on the news from their government's perspective. But the Russians did the exact same thing. Only they've been able to weaponize it in a way that few other countries have. And there's a tradition of this with disinformation and active measures, where they actually go in, and they did it in Russia, and they've done it in Syria, where they send in the little green men, they send in the influence peddlers, and they start tilting the narrative and start turning the population against one another. And that's what they inherently believe is a weakness in American democracy.
And in that regard, in that context, what's your take on the growing evidence that there was, in fact, a lot of conversation, meetings between Trump associates, including his son-in-law, his main guy, Jared Kushner, and the Russian embassy, Russian operatives, directly tied to Putin. And, the investigation is going on. We're likely to have more hearings. We're likely to see some kind of charges, at least against somebody, if not a whole bunch of people.
Sure. So I have three general points in that. One, those conversations occur. We know that they occur, and it's not just the Russians, the Chinese, the British, the Germans, the French. Anybody who has an economic interest in the United States actually matters, is going to have those kind of off-the-record conversations with both campaigns. So let's just lay that on the table and just understand that that's just how that works. And quite frankly, that's probably how it should work. That's a normal, mundane environment. The second part of it is that we do know that there's a lot of smoke. So you've already had Putin just a couple days ago actually go back and actually say that point blank. It's like, well, maybe some patriotic citizens in Russia went a little overzealous and going and hacking things and things of this nature. At that point, maybe he's just trolling everybody. But the fact of the matter is that the Russians did have an invested interest in the outcome of the United States elections and used pathways that, by and large, because we have freedom of speech in the United States, they're free to do so. But was there active collusion, violation of campaign finance? There's a lot of smoke, but we don't have any fire quite yet. And I guess that gets us to the third point in all of this, is that the wheels of justice turn slowly, but they turn. And eventually, whether it's a cover-up or whether it's anything else, we'll get to the bottom of it.
So you have confidence in Mueller's leadership as a special counsel?
I do, and I think we have to, right? Because backing away from all this and looking at the meta-narrative, the one thing that active measures or disinformation that they try to do is try to undermine people's confidence in our institutions. And the best way to fight against that is to put trust in these institutions. America's been around for 250 years, 400 years on this continent, if you really want to wind it all the way back. We've been around for a long time. Our institutions are strong. The American people are very resilient. And when presented with an exterior threat, they tend to unite rather quickly. I'm pretty confident that if there is something there, we will get to the bottom of it. If there's not something there, at least we're aware.
At least we'll clear the smoke.
At least we'll clear the smoke, and we'll be much more aware of how foreign governments influence American elections. And that'll make for a better American voter at the end of the day. But again, if there really is fire there, they will act, and they will act very quickly. But we should be very careful not to get caught into the hype, because I don't want to say that's what the Russians want. But again, there's a lot of people out there that are playing for control of your mind and your thoughts and your actions. Just put that on pause and make sure that the thoughts are really yours.
And speaking of the faith in institutions, it's not just the justice system and investigative bodies, but it's journalism itself. The Russians have a vested interest in hearing America scream fake news and not trusting what professional journalists are reporting as fact and truth. And I should say, we don't always get it right, but the real journalists are the ones who are the first to say, I got it wrong, and I'm correcting myself. That's what a real journalist does.
Right. And you've said this a number of times. Like, the Fourth Estate has been generating some of the best journalism we've seen in decades.
It's amazing.
There is some excellent quality stuff coming out, whether it's New York Times, Politico, Washington Post. And these are guys that know how to get to the bottom of things. We've seen this, whether it was McDonnell in 2013, whether it's Watergate, whatever the case may be. Pick a story. Vice, for instance, who's done some great investigative journalism back in Syria and Iraq. These are organizations that know how to get a story right. They know how to source it. They know how to dive deeply and then present that story as it becomes, moves from truth rather than just a collection of facts.
Right.
There's great journalism being done out there.
There's reason to have faith and to celebrate journalism.
Exactly.
In 2017.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And is it happening at the speed of social media? Absolutely it is. Are folks going to get it wrong every once in a while? Absolutely it is. Are there people out there actively invested and paid to make sure journalists get it wrong? You bet, right? And they're going to do everything in their power to hang those guys and say, see, you can't trust them because they got it wrong one time. Don't buy into that. You know, these are human beings that are working on a human story involving human people, right? And a human process that's going to be an aggregation of facts that will approximate the truth.
But it's used as that one moment where you get it wrong, often being set up to get it wrong, but that is used by Trump supporters to attack the left. And as you have said when we talk on the radio many times, that really is the ultimate goal for the Trump supporters.
Oh, sure.
Not to be right, not even to win elections. The ultimate goal is just to hurt the left. To see the left apoplectic, their hair on fire, professors screaming, I can't believe this. That's what makes them happy.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, frankly, you're seeing this with a lot of the Antifa movement too, and I'm no supporter of Antifa, but you know, you're seeing a lot of the social media stuff that's actually spitting up some of the worst.
And tell me what that is. That's
it's the anti-fascists. So they're actually very active in Europe, actually fighting real fascists. But in the United States, I mean, they're kind of far and few between. But still, I mean, you get one or two instances of stupid out there, and the social media literally jumps on it, finds it, magnifies it to 100, treats every protester, no matter whether or not they're Antifa to supporting, you know, puppy dogs, as the same, and saying, yep, here they go. This is what the left really wants at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, it happens with the left too. They'll find somebody like Richard Spencer and they'll turn him into a you know, a Rockefeller Republican at the end of the day.
He's about to take down America.
Yeah. But again, don't buy into that hype. That's the real catch of it all. You know, the really interesting thing about all of this too is that it's, I mean, public affairs firms, you know, social media, all of that, they're paid to do this kind of thing. You know, this is all saccharine. I mean, you almost got to break through the crust and sort of get through the other side to really find out what's going on. But I mean, they're paid to form your opinions for you before you have a chance to form an opinion yourself.
And people are falling prey to that quite a bit.
And we got to fight that. That's the real task of the next 5 years, in my opinion.
Shaun, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shaun Kenney, you can find him on Twitter at @SVKenney. You can read his work at the Jeffersoniad and at bearingdrift.com. You can find the complete archive of our program right here online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.